Very quickly to introduce myself. So my name's Jamie Lancaster. I'm the head of our German recruitment division here at Third Republic. We've been running these CTO events for a while now, and we found them massively beneficial for like-minded people like yourself to be able to come together in a forum, have a topic of discussion, and really to use each other to learn things, but also share ideas and share beliefs and share different ways of thinking, which ultimately will hopefully benefit your businesses. And really pleased that you could all attend today. We've got two speakers today. So we have Florian Loretan and Stefan Hanke with us.
Maybe a few more words about Wunder. So I'm currently CTO there, actually not for very long. I will be moving on. But yeah, so we are a team, a quite big team for a web software agency. So we have 130 people, out of which about 100 people are developers or people in technical roles. We are kind of distributed first, so between 2 offices in Finland, 3 offices in Latvia, people in Estonia, and also quite a few people working from different places all over the world, like myself. Yeah, so this is maybe the context in which we're building stuff. And before I talk about happiness and what that really means, so maybe quick thing about DevOps. I'm guessing everybody here is quite familiar with DevOps. If you're not, I would really recommend this book, The Phoenix Project. It's not a textbook. It doesn't explain what DevOps is. It's actually a novel, and it tells the story of a project that's gone horribly wrong, that's over budget, over the deadline. And it's really a fascinating read. I've recommended to a lot of the technology leaders at Wunder and outside of Wunder as well. And I won't go into any of the story, but pretty much the gist of the learnings from this novel is really these 3 ways of DevOps. And here again, I won't go into details, but it's pretty much about minimizing interruptions in the flow of work throughout your organization as much as possible, then iterating and looking for new ways of doing things. Well, not for new ways, for better ways of doing things, addressing every single issue that we run into. And then the last one is really looking for new ways to generate value and to improve the overall system. So not only from a technical perspective, but from an organizational perspective. But this is very nice, but what does this have to do with happiness? And I would argue that in a work context, at least, happiness is really strongly correlated with motivation. And we know motivated developers are more effective, they're more focused, they're more engaged. So this is definitely something that you want to have. And there's been a good amount of research that has been put into what it is that motivates people. And among those, there is this book by Daniel Pink, Drive. And in this book, he argues that there are really 3 things that motivate people. And I think these 3 things are definitely applicable to developers. The first one is autonomy. People want to be able to control their actions. They want to be in a context where they can choose what it is that they're going to be doing. And I think for developers, it's definitely this definitely works. If you prevent people from being able to make certain decisions, from being able to use certain software or certain tools that they want, this is a very easy way to make developers unhappy. So giving autonomy will definitely improve their happiness. The second one is mastery. And in the book, the example that is given is people wanting to learn a musical instrument or do sports. And the reason there is that they want to get better, they want to have this mastery, do one thing really well. And this might not be for all developers, but I would say for the vast majority of developers, they care about their craft. They care about having good coding skills, about creating good quality output. So yes, another thing that really will play a key role in the motivation of developers. And last but not least, there's the purpose. Why do we do this? And usually for most developers, they get paid enough that it's not about paying rent. The reason why they do it, it's also, well, maybe for some junior developers, they care about the technology. They want to do the cool technology. But the more people progress in their career, the more they see that the purpose is actually not in the technology itself, but it's in the impact that the solutions that we build have on the community, on the world around us. So how do we put this into concrete actions and concrete workflows at Wunder? And we have a system called Silta. Silta is the Finnish word for bridge. And the idea there is really to bridge this whole workflow, this whole process from an idea, from creating something all the way to a functioning product that is used in production. And I will show you how we do this and how we bring these different drivers of motivation into the system. So this is a very simplistic workflow, and I'm happy to talk about the details if anybody's interested. But pretty much what we start with is the developer pushing code to GitHub. We use GitHub there and a few other hosted solutions that are pretty much available off the shelf. So this is really nothing particularly specific, and we combine those with simple open source tools like Docker, Kubernetes, and Helm to create environments. So what we do, the developer pushes to GitHub, GitHub triggers a CI build, and we build the application and deploy to a cluster. So pretty simple, nothing really complex there. And yes, I'm skipping a few small steps, but this is the basic system that we have. And how does this system actually encourage autonomy? And it starts with very simple things. First of all, how you set up your permissions for GitHub. And I know this is not going to work in every single context, but in our situation, when we create a lot of different projects for different clients, we also want to be able to experiment. It's really crucial to let the developers create their own repositories without needing to ask for permission, without needing to ask for a credit card. Everybody is able to do this. And that means that we have no friction at the very first step of starting a new project. We also make sure that everybody has read access to everything. So this way, when somebody's wondering, hey, is anybody else in the organization doing something similar, they don't need to ask and find the right person. They're just able to search it. So we make it as easy as possible for people to do the things that they need to do. And thanks to the automation that we have with the continuous integration and all those, like those pieces of code, pretty much when somebody takes a template repository and just pushes it, then we get a working environment automatically. So there is no need to ask for permission, no need to ask for budget. It's possible for people to create a repository and automatically they get a working environment with their application that's deployed, that they can they can develop it, they can do everything that they need to do themselves. And this is really a key point. And actually, we had this situation just like a couple of weeks ago. We launched a new project in production, and our operations team was absolutely not involved in any of this. So the developer team were really able to do everything from creating a new project to launching it in production without any intervention from the operations team. But what is there that, I mean, it's nice to have something that works out of the box. What is there? Actually, one of the key files with this template repository, it's empty. And the reason it's empty, it's done on purpose, is because the defaults actually work out of the box to give you something that works. So this is also something that we wanted to make sure that in sense of complexity, there's not a long sequence of steps that people need to do to set up a new project. It's pretty much create something, clone something, and then it works out of the box. Of course, well, there's more to it. So there are definitely things that a lot of cases, a lot of projects need, not all of them, but there are things that are very common. For example, in our case, using Elasticsearch. And we made sure that the things that are common, so common tasks, are very simple and easy to do. And in this case, you need Elasticsearch, so it's a search engine, search database, and just by putting this, it automatically creates the service, creates the containers, all of that. It also correctly integrates the search service into the framework that we use. So it integrates all of the complexity, and actually, because it's something that is very common, that we enable it right there. And then, of course, well, not everything is simple. Sometimes there are things that are complex. And then for those cases, yes, it's okay to have something that's a bit more complex. This is not something that is needed for simple things, but when there are complex requirements, yes, it's okay. We need to make sure that it's possible to have that complexity. So we're not building a system that restricts what people can do. It just provides easy defaults, easy ways to do the things that are very common, and then the things that are more complex, more challenging, that are more like project or use case specific, then these are still possible. And then it comes to mastery. And actually the thing that developers care about, yes, they want mastery, but they don't want mastery of the system. They don't care about Kubernetes. They don't care about servers. And yes, there's some really cool technology and that powers the underlying system, but this is not what the developers care about. The developers care about building really nice user interfaces. They care about React. They care about middleware and how data flows in their application. They don't care how the system is being provisioned. And what we see is that with this setup, we are actually enabling the developers to focus on the thing that they really care about. And if we take a look at the interaction that we had before between developers and operations, is pretty much a developer creates some application. They need to have an environment, a server in which they need to deploy this. They ask the operations, operation created, well, they ask for a ticket, they get their ticket, they create the servers, they let the developers know. And all this back and forth is frustrating, and it's frustrating for everyone. And everybody's reliant on skill sets that they don't have and that other people have. And what we are able to do with the system is that we are automating everything so that the developers can really do everything by themselves. Do we still need operations? Yes, of course, we still need operations. We don't have a system that's perfect, but the role of the operations people is really to support the developers, to guide the developers, to help the developers do the things that they need to do on their own instead of doing it for them. And what we see is that it's very nice because we develop a symbiosis where the developers can also bring some best practices into those templates. So for example, when it comes to code style and linting, to automated security scans and things like that, that might be at the application level, then we're able to have a system where everybody brings in their expertise without being dependent on others. And it definitely brings a much better collaboration model. Then when it comes to purpose, yes, I mentioned the purpose is in the software, in the user of the software. It's in the impact that the software has, not on the software itself. Yes, and the whole automated platform, it does bring benefits to the end users, but they're never going to see this directly. But if we take a look at it from the perspective of the operations team, we see that their role changes from having to deliver something that would ideally be there yesterday to a model where they're actually helping other people do things on their own. And this really changes the collaboration. And we see that it really gives a purpose, a completely different purpose to our operations team. And this is something that I think is quite exciting, that when we take a look at these two books, that's actually, they're in completely different categories. They don't really have that much in common, but both of these have 3 key points. And then if we put these key points side by side, we see that actually the 3 ways of the DevOps methodology actually match quite well with the 3 key drivers of motivation. And this is something that, to be honest, it wasn't there when we started building the system 2 years ago. It's really something that has evolved over time, and I've come to this realization, hey, there is a really good alignment there. the key driver, like one of the key drivers for the reason why we wanted to put the system in place was to make developers happier and encourage their productivity. So it wasn't necessarily about the production environment. It was really about facilitating the developer experience. But we see that in the end, we actually really succeeded at having a system that in a way makes our developers happier. This is something that is super exciting. I'm really stoked about this. And I would definitely be happy to talk with others about like how to do this very concretely in different types of teams. But this example that I gave, it's about what worked at Wunder in one type of organization, developing one type of software. It doesn't necessarily work in other places. And I think it's really important to take that into account. What type of organization do you have, and what do you want to address there? But yes, so this is how we make developers a little bit happier, and it seems to work. But I would also be very interested, how do you do that? So, thank you.
Thank you, Florian, very much.
Florian, in my experience too, like autonomy has been a critical component to creating not only happy engineering teams, but also effective engineering teams. In your experience, how do you establish the right degree of autonomy for your teams? For instance, in your company, how did you guys arrive at the decision of using Kubernetes, for instance, instead of having one team using Kubernetes, two using Mesos, a fourth building their own container system, and all the good stuff?
So I think for us, all the applications that we built, that it was actually the right context to have one cluster for everything. So one cluster for all the dev environments, one cluster for everything that's in production. It's really like pretty much all that level of decision was with the operations team. But it's true in a different context, maybe where you need to deploy things to different environment, maybe on-premise environments that have like different requirements for different clients. Then you need to have a lot more diversity there and a lot more flexibility that might not it wouldn't be possible to standardize this easily. So pretty much what we've seen, and maybe it's at a different level, we make those decisions based on what it is that we standardize on. So we want to make sure that it's possible to go off the existing path, but then this is where it stops being like, oh, I just want this, you enable it, and it's there. And for example, if you want to use, let's say, Apache Solr instead of Elasticsearch, yes, it's possible, but we don't provide it as an option out of the box. It could be, and a good example, we had a system that needed a queuing system. We used RabbitMQ. At first, it was a special thing, that like special requirements. The team was able to get this set up. And then we were like, hey, this is actually a good thing. Let's integrate that back into the core system. And now it's an option that is available to everyone. So it's really through this back and forth that, like, do we have something that is used just for this one specific use case, or is it then something that we can use everywhere? But very often, the people who are driving a new addition to the system, they try it for themselves first, and then once they have something that works, then it's up to them to convince other people that, hey, this is really something that everyone should have as an option.
Awesome. If I may build upon then my question and your answer, how do you get the knowledge that was built to solve a particular problem in one team across multiple teams so that it may be reused?
So this is definitely one thing that's a bit tricky. So as I mentioned, just giving like flexible read access to all the other projects, that makes it easy when somebody knows somebody must have done something with this technology and then look for that. It works very well in some cases, not in all of them. And what we have, so we have put in place a guild structure. So we have different guilds for different skill sets, and this really provides the right context for people to share, hey, I have tried this, it worked really well, but this aspect was a pain, and we ended up skipping that, or these types of really practical experience. For certain things that everybody uses, we found that documentation can be quite useful, but even better than documentation is actually having options that take these things into account and really kind of providing the documentation through the API that we provide through configuration.
Isn't there an inherent conflict between autonomy of developers in DevOps versus high-level requirements that a technical organization might have in regards to resource monitoring, costs, security aspects, regulations that you might follow, the necessity of being able to audit your code at any time? So how do you resolve that? Because I think, yes, it makes a developer happy if he could use whatever he likes, but this will always be in conflict with a manager who takes responsibility for the systems that are running and how much they cost and if they're safe. How do you level that off?
The basic approach that we have, so we try to put as many things built in terms of like security control, in terms of cost control. So for example, each project, even though it's a shared cluster, each project gets deployed to a dedicated namespace that is fully isolated in terms of like network policies. So we put as much security in place. We've been audited multiple times. We know that this is actually quite solid. And then for cost control, for example, we give people free access to the development cluster, and everything that gets deployed there will be downscaled after a day if not used.
Okay.
So that means that even if somebody's creating a quick experiment, it's there for a day, and if they're not using it, then it doesn't cost anything, or it costs almost nothing. And then if we have one project with 20 developers and everybody's creating feature branches and we're building like 100 times a day, then it actually matches because we're actually invoicing our client for these 20 developers working full-time. So we actually have costs that match quite well with the revenue that we generate. But yeah, in terms of monitoring, and there are definitely some, so it doesn't work in all environments. So if you're in highly regulated environments, this might be tricky. But in general, we try to follow the practice of trust but verify. So we let people create their own resources, and then we also monitor pretty closely the cost of the cluster. And if we see, hey, this one project is taking 20% of the cost, we need to reach out to the team.
And this applies to production environments as well?
This applies to production environment as well. And there we monitor for like, well, a good example is you have an application that performs really badly, and then the team decides, hey, let's just throw more hardware at it, like set a bunch of memory, and then things will be okay. And these are the type of things, like we see them and we try to be in sync regarding them. But there again, for example, when it comes to scaling, we see that it makes a lot more sense to allow systems to scale and then to follow up when that happens, because we accidentally had this one situation where the auto scaling had a limit, and this was pretty much at the beginning of the Corona lockdown, when the website of a university announced that they were closing the classrooms. Then we had a huge peak in traffic, and it would have been very nice to actually follow that peak rather than say, hey, the autoscaler is limited to 8 instances, rather than just allowing for more.
Okay, last question. Your developers seem to be happy. Are your operations people also happy? What's their biggest complaint?
Actually, what we've seen is that they're also very happy. They're pretty much, this has, well, the system that we had previously was quite traditional, virtual machines and so on, and they had they needed to do a lot of repetitive tasks, setting up servers and so on, and so it was really difficult for them to learn and to improve, and they had a long backlog of like, hey, these are the things we need to change the firewall configuration across these 200 servers. We'll get to it at some point, but first I need to set up the new server. And now what we have done is that we had pretty much for the past year and a half, more or less, everything that we have done has been moved to this new infrastructure, and it pretty much takes it just takes like 1 or 2 people to manage this entire setup, and then the rest of the team, like three other people, are maintaining all the legacy stuff. And so the more systems we move over to this new platform, the more people are able to work on things that reduce the amount of manual work that they need to do, and that frees them to work on improving the system. And this kind of becomes this virtual cycle that really lets them do more interesting things. So
thank you.
Actually, from both sides, it's been positive.
Thanks.
Sounds like a very nice tool to have inside the company, but I think you have put some effort to build such a tool, such a
Yes.
system in-house. What was the context of Wunder when you decided to go for Silta and build it? Because I guess you take such an effort and expecting it will pay off in the future. Has it also paid off, or are you still measuring that?
Yeah, so it's definitely something that's difficult to measure. What we saw is that when doing different surveys with developers and different discussions, also discussions with our account managers, with the type of problems that our clients were reporting regarding like certain things being too slow and so on, we definitely saw we have a pain point there. It was difficult to say how much money it was costing us, but what we've seen is that by introducing this, as I mentioned, there's a positive impact on the workflow of the developers and the operations people, but we've also seen that there's a big benefit when it comes to the way that we sell this to our client. So previously, hosting was something that it was a pure cost that the client had to pay for, but they were not very happy to pay for because it didn't bring any value in their eyes. And with the system, we actually gained quite a few major, large clients that came to us saying, hey, our hosting system, it's every time that we need to do something, it's expensive and it fails, and it costs us a lot of energy to put into these projects. And we've been able to sell them to sell this new workflow and new platform to them. They were very, very happy. So I think the revenue that we can generate from this, we've already gotten to the point where it has paid for itself.
How do you balance autonomy with accountability, mastery with pragmatism? Like sometimes we just gotta ship something and get it out there. It might not be the most interesting things ever. And how do you convey the importance of a purpose that oftentimes is not that sexy? It's like something super business related and might not sound super exciting to engineers, even like the more senior ones.
Yeah. That's a good point. It's not always easy, and I think that we've definitely seen there are some projects that excite everyone, some projects that really don't, where it's a lot more difficult. I would say in general we've been pretty lucky with like having people who have this kind of level of pragmatism, and one of the things that I would say has probably helped a lot is when we work together with a client, we don't just treat them as like one client and then they send us money and we send them code. It's really much more like we have workshops, we work together, they're part of the daily, we meet with their stakeholders, they meet our people, and this really creates a one team where it doesn't really matter who's employed where. And then suddenly it's like when working together in this way, suddenly it makes a lot more sense for the developers to say, actually, you're asking me to build this, but I think this would be a better solution, and really have this type of discussions. Well, there's this new framework that might do better, and kind of taking joint decisions with the stakeholders. Of course, sometimes there are like very technical details that there's no point in involving the stakeholders if they don't understand. But I think like really good communication there and providing some good transparency can help a lot.
So I'm in general an operations guy, right? And from the operations standpoint, I think it's a very fascinating use case. One, you you've explained sounds really cool, and I think it's where many operational leads want to go in this no ops, so to say, direction. The question is, it probably requires quite a bit of a process change and also quite a bit of a change in the skill set for the operation people, especially if you initially had an old school operation guys, right?
Yep.
More of a system admin guys. So the question is, what were the main pitfalls here? So maybe there was some resistance to change from the people, or some issues with the like upskilling the guys and things like that.
There was definitely a pretty big resistance. I remember the first time that I had a conversation with the guy who today is the team lead for that. He looked at Kubernetes and said, "I don't like it." And I think there it's really important to kind of communicate the purpose, the why, and also these aspects like, hey, it actually, you know this backlog of things that you want to improve. How about we get to a system where you actually get to work on these things rather than just like adding more things to the backlog continuously and working on manual tasks. But yeah, it's been a big change. Also, it's like also from the developer side, it's been a change because developers were used to like, hey, I need a server. And then they're like, oh yeah, well, create it yourself. And it's like, we made sure that this onboarding experience was as good as possible, but we definitely had a few people who were surprised. And then also some like people who were positively surprised at the end of the first day on a project. They're like, hey, I set up a server myself today. But it's definitely something that we had to do some training with the developers, with the operations people, actually invest quite a bit in that upskilling there, but also involving our salespeople, involving our service managers. So there's a lot of different aspects of the organizations that definitely needed to be considered as well.
And did you need to do any major shifts in the operations teams? Means like any, I don't know, firings or hiring a big bunch of new people with the required skill set or something like that?
Actually, one of the things that we tried early on was to hire somebody with more cloud and Kubernetes experience than the existing team had, and it turned out to not really work. And we found that actually the cultural fit was much more important than the technology skills. So it's easy to get some additional consulting if needed. And what we've found also as well, which was quite valuable. So a lot of the work that we do is based on open source software, and just being involved in that community and talking with other people who are building the same type of application, deploying those same types of applications. We've had some really positive exchanges about simple things like you need a file system that's mounted in multiple places. By default, this is very difficult to do, but our framework requires that. How do you do that? And sometimes those specific challenges have been a lot easier to address when it's possible to tap into the open source community around those projects.
Florian, thank you. That was really interesting and some really, really good questions to follow up there. So thank you, guys. We're going to pass over to Stefan now.
The role I'm talking about today is basically head of SRE within Amadeus. And here, I guess I take you slightly now into maybe a different world. I guess we all want to be startups, but I sense Amadeus is more like a mature, not to say old startup. So we are in the market for 30 years. Let me talk about a little bit about the business we are doing. So basically, we are powering the travel industry with our solutions. We're partnering with airlines, with airports, with hotels, with rail providers, then obviously classical travel agencies, and then also online travel agencies, car rental, whatever there is out there. Basically, I guess we are the glue in between all of those providers for travel services. And while I talk about, let's say, for example, airlines and airports, just to give you an idea about the criticality, we are also running check-in systems. And I mean, I guess all of us used to fly maybe a couple of months back, but we all used to fly. And now think about an airport like Munich or Frankfurt, and check-in is down. you create chaos within minutes. So this is actually the criticality we are looking at here. So all of our systems are sort of high availability systems which have to follow very, very strict SLA requirements. I mean, we are in the market for more than 30 years. We have more than 20,000 employees. Out of that, something like 10,000 developers. So I started already what Amadeus is doing. And so the last slide, you just see some quick examples of our business, basically. And I guess we're a world market leader in that space, depending a little bit how you count the numbers. Now, my role as SRE is basically coming from the ops side. So I'm from operations, and with the team of SRE engineers, we are basically supporting more than 3 Amadeus data centers. Coming there or being there because of we build them ourselves or because of mergers and acquisitions. We are basically in all big clouds. So I have projects going in AWS, in Azure, just finished a very nice pilot in Azure using Citrix. And then obviously we're also in Google with our pricing engine. And we have various hosting providers across the globe, whether it is in Munich, whether it is in Singapore, we are working with. And now talking about my team, this is basically plus 400 IT engineers. And we had this in the discussion before. I mean, very classical admin profiles and guys I'm working with for sometimes plus 10 years and who helped me very, very much in tricky and very difficult technical discussions and issues, not to say incidents, over the last years. So very, very strong teams and grown teams. But as it came up in the discussion before, not necessarily the profiles that really help you now moving into DevOps and where you need some coding skills, some other engineering skills. And then a second thing which makes the journey pretty difficult, because if you talk about Scrum, if you talk about all of these agile techniques, it's all about bring everybody in one room, do Scrum every day, and everybody is basically in there. When you are with your core operations team and development teams at more than 10 sites in the US, in Europe, in APAC, quite big population in India, obviously that is a challenge. And also our operations as such is built up as follow the sun. So I don't have clean sites in terms of one service is built out of Boston, the other one is built out of Sydney. No, it's basically all of the services will be at all sites or at the main sites in order to really do follow the sun operations. So always working day shift in European time zone, US time zone, and then Asia Pac time zone. And then obviously you can imagine over 30 years of operations or development or IT service activities, we do have quite a big zoo of technologies, of application, architecture stacks. So I'm just putting here 10 plus, which is basically the big ones, but we are also taking over customer platforms, so specific tech stacks from the customer, including specific operations processes from the customer. So let's go ahead maybe and see how we started that journey. So because for such a large shop, I guess it is a multi-year exercise to jump into this. When we started the serious work on it in 2015, and the first thing we did together with the teams is moving from classical functional teams to cross-functional teams. So basically breaking up a sysadmin team, a DB admin team, application management teams, and bring all of these guys into basically one team. This is, you can imagine, is causing a lot of challenges with people that are used to have same knowledge just on the other side of the desk, where they could always start discussions and ask questions, where they now have basically not exactly that skill set within the team, and they are basically the only and the best and the most knowledgeable guy in the team for a certain subject. So this was a basic step to do, very challenging to really change the job profiles of more than 1,000 people to work in a different mode. The second thing was to define platform strategy. And this is really, let's say, going away from an app stack based handling of topics to a platform strategy in terms of defining ARs, defining PaaS, defining certain services like OS as a service, DB as a service, and to centralize that as a service offering to the developer and ops community, and only put the app-specific elements of that within the teams and let them work on the specific stuff. And then the third element, which was very important basically to do, is to start implementing Lean. And here my focus was very much on data-driven decision making. So really bring people into defining KPIs that matter to them, bringing them into dashboards, bringing them into operational review kind of culture, and start a serious continuous improvement process, which is based on facts. Because you can imagine a shop like this, there is entertainment every day, everywhere. And if you don't have a guideline to follow, which is based on data and certain decisions on what focus we take, you end up nowhere. All right, if we let's then look into basically our DevOps journey. So going to basically DevOps was indeed a challenge if you think about the skill set we had, if you can imagine about the processes and the maturity of our processes. But in addition to that, budget processes, very rigid. You have PM teams or product management teams, not necessarily too much interested in technology and servers and infrastructure and all of these good things, very much looking at features and functions basically. So you really had to find a way to push this through by basically convincing people and find peers that are willing to follow, let's say peers in particular on the R&D or dev side, which were willing to follow that journey. This was really about defining the building blocks and convincing people about productivity, about, let's say, higher motivation of our teams, about talking about, let's say, time to market. And then basically inviting them to invest in terms of helping to skill up my own people and to build, let's say, teams together. Let me show you, how we started that journey. And for me, one of the big points to get it starting was basically to get away from this idea of it is a cultural change, DevOps is a mindset change, and to really bring people into the mood of doing a pragmatic first step, and to overcome this whole thing of a bigger transformation, but to really start hands-on and pragmatic. And so we defined, let's say, pilot teams, which basically where we agreed to build up a virtual setup, so a virtual combined teams that would start to share backlogs. So basically where we would put typical functional backlog, so releases, features, feature loads, basically to share this with operational loads, security loads, all of these kind of things which come basically from the infrastructure side, and allow people to learn basically what's behind it, why are they important, because right now, before that, we were basically separating these things out, and there was only basic people having some question marks on why would not be allowed to load in a certain load window, why were they occupied, why were there restrictions, all of that. And by opening up this and bringing teams into one combined teams, even in a virtual setup, basically they were starting to understand and to really share the mission. We did combine this with redefining responsibilities and accountabilities. So basically giving this team the full accountability for their backlog and for their commitments for certain dates committed with customers. And if you see on the next slide, this is some of the elements basically we put in place to give this some guidance and to explain, to give people some tooling at hand to work with this. So there were certain ceremonies we put in place in terms of daily stand-ups with a challenge of how do you do this when you have 3 time zones basically to work with? How do you do this if you're not necessarily get, let's say, this based hooked up in the intranet, and everybody, for example, being familiar with use of Jira and other tools. So quite some basically some challenges to overcome. And we did start this, basically putting this along with a release pipeline of products and platforms. You know, on the roles we did define, let's say, Scrum Masters, product owners, PTR, so problem ticket and incident management, sheriffs who would basically make sure that SLAs are met and that people would find a good balance between taking care of incidents and continue to also work on commitments towards our customers in terms of projects. Yeah? And obviously there were some artifacts generated, like a common backlog, like a list of impediments, and then also basically we're working on continuously improving automation, coming in with Ansible, defining playbooks, moving the whole shop into a blueprint-driven deployment model. You see some of the elements, how we combine this day-to-day run and the idea of continuous improvement, and also the necessity to basically reserve these capacities, because not necessarily on the R&D side everybody was happy to indeed work on automation where they felt like this is an operational task. So we divided basically our day-to-day life, or the day-to-day operations, into two big groups. So CIA, that stands for Continuous Improvement and Automation Scrum. And then we had the operational Scrum to basically manage the day-to-day run. Now, one big element for me as let's say, coming from operations was, I was in the need to define what is in it for a product manager, so for marketing, for sales, who needs to invest in this. What's in it for an R&D head if he would basically give me resources to focus on building up automation, on helping, let's say, operational teams to skill up. So measuring the success of all of this was, from day one, a huge requirement to basically internally prove it is working, and also to drive the continuous improvement, but also towards our customers to show you are getting something out of it. So if you move into the next slide, you see the categories of the dashboards we were basically putting into place. And you see here, it was important for us to run operations with some initiative KPIs. We wanted to show the teams how they improved their agility, some specific DevOps KPIs, business KPIs, and people related. And I just want to make it very short, but if you show some of the examples, these were basically KPIs we were putting in place, also because we allowed teams in the beginning to experiment. So not necessarily everywhere in the world, or for certain products and services, our DevOps setup was exactly the same. So we said, guys, we need some of the elements need to be the same in terms of how do you document your backlog, how do you document your release pipeline and what you are doing, because of on-call services or other guys needing to work with what is getting implemented. But we also wanted to allow the people to experiment a little bit, and so we identified these KPIs and allowed the teams to measure those, to also learn and basically get excited about the improvements they were doing. Now, if we go ahead, let me show you really quick before we continue the discussion on how the journey on Amadeus side will continue. Now, as we are basically now establishing, and we rolled out DevOps to a community of plus 1,200 people, so 400 on my side. And if you take this to the R&D, I would get a big guess that it's something like 1,200, 1,500 people now working in this different way of working. We are now going the next step, going into a scaled agile framework, using SAFe methodology to now also take the bigger run in terms of the bigger view on it, in terms of defining now release teams that are, let's say, taking care of all epics important for a product development. And our part is obviously to define within that the run piece. And then in the next step, we are also now taking organizational steps to to combine the SRE, which is still an operational function, with development. Yeah? So we will basically, for sure, in the next months to come, see that SRE would more going into a development team, whereas the operations will simply or much more focus on the platform services and providing all of these services everybody can benefit from and allow them to give more flexibility and autonomy to development teams. So this is basically what I wanted to share with you, let's say, showing you my experience doing this, let's say, in a very traditional setup, I tend to say, looking at that we have quite some startups here also in the discussion, and also show you how this works. If you have a lot of people involved, if you often respect, let's say, labor law limitations or unions to also be involved in this, or works councils to be involved in this, where you indeed have to, let's say, consider a lot of elements and stakeholders while you change completely the way of working of dev and ops teams.
Thanks. I assume this is still an ongoing process, or it probably never ends.
Well, absolutely. No. It's really an ongoing process. You have some stakeholders who really want to be with it. And we were very, very lucky to recruit a number of R&D heads to lead our teams, or to help the teams, to give them guidance on that journey. And also, I mean, that question came up, I would believe, from Marcella. You cannot do this without changing brains. So we had to recruit. So over the last 2 years, I completely stopped recruiting for classical profiles, sysadmins, DBAs, really focusing on SRE profiles, on DevOps profiles, bringing in development expertise into the shop, because you cannot simply do this. And you need to allow your traditional, let's say, ops roles and sysadmins who really did very, very good things for you in the past, to stay on top of it, you know, to allow them to keep their expertise level, because for them this is very, very difficult to be an expert as a Unix sysadmin and then fall down to a beginner level. This is something you really, really want to avoid, to allow them to keep the pace and learn while you change the processes.
Or when did you start this process? So how long has it been going? And the second question is, what was the biggest failure? Where did you crash the most?
I mean, so we started in 2015, so we did a big reorg in 2015, introducing cross-functional teams. That was the biggest change, and it's still not really working super well in terms of how do you manage to also allow the subject matter expert to, in their community, to develop their skill set. Yeah, so let's say developing still sysadmin roles to decide which OS to use, to decide which features to use out of a specific release. This is something which is still very, very difficult. We try to do this by introducing communities in addition to the line organization, which was cross-functional and had subject matter communities. And I would believe, Alexander, this is still an area where we still have difficulties to really get the old, very good guys on board to follow the journey. I would really believe that is still a big challenge.
So you said that you have something like 400 plus people in the SRE operation system administration team.
Yes.
And I'm guessing that the introduction of the DevOps methodology could probably increase the efficiency of this team. So the question is, do you still need the same amount of people or not? Or how does it work for you?
So, I mean, Dimitri, basically we were able to prove that productivity went down. So we saw mean time to repair going down. We saw more releases coming in. Now, the problem I have is it differs a little bit on the platforms I'm looking at. Yeah? We were driving a huge private cloud setup. So here you can imagine it is quite easy to show and to really adjust to a different way of working, because the tech stack, the cloud technology simply support it very well. Now, in the old world, let's say, or the classical stacks, where I also have to work with a lot of technical debt because of many, many reasons, this is not that crystal clear. So right now, and also because I believe we were sort of underutilized, not having enough resources on the ops side. We were not really able to free up resources, but I guess we can show that we are also working in the old world technical depth of faster than we did before. We stick to the deco projects much better and to the degree timelines than we did before, I guess. That's maybe how we can demonstrate there is productivity gains.
Another question as well. So you told that you're implementing the cross-functional teams, right? Does it mean that your SRE people are now like a part of product teams as well, like working together with the developers, or like what is your setup?
Yes, correct.
In regards to SRE?
Right. So the first step we did when we started 2015 was to really break up these silos, like you have a sysadmin team or multiple sysadmin teams, multiple database teams, and multiple application management teams. We were breaking this up by putting, let's say, 2 sysadmins with 2 application managers with 2 DBAs into one team, combined with demand management, with some network expertise, some specific infrastructure expertise, and to let them build up a team now where they were able to really support a service pretty much in a release cycle from end to end. And the second step, which kicked in then, let's say 2018, by introducing the first pilots of DevOps. Here we were then also able to integrate R&D, so dev resources within those teams, and to really now expand the scope also to seriously develop tools, seriously to allow teams to anticipate their own monitoring tools and the way they work, by also introducing now coding skills, introducing R&D teams into these groups.
How big are your teams? Let's say if you said it's end to end and cross-functional, and how you maybe group those teams together, maybe to make like one service.
Basically, Martin, we have teams which the size is typically like 10 to 15, 20 people sometimes. What is important is sometimes we do have teams, let's say, in triple setup, because I might have a team taking care of certain cluster of or group of applications or IT services in Sydney, then I have a similar team doing this in Erding, and I have a similar team doing this in Miami. So basically that was always a challenge. So how do we also make sure 24/7 operations within that? And we are right now on the journey trying to limit this 3-site setup to maybe 2 sites, introducing also now India, which is somewhere a little bit in the middle, looking at APAC, to try to allow the teams to focus better, because this 3-site setup is not allowing the teams to really get the real depth and go to an expertise level that is really matching with an R&D team only focusing on a certain set of services, on a certain set of engines or tools to support an IT service.
What are your best tools which you use to integrate operations and developers, let's say, in the teams, that it's a real working team?
Basically, it's really basic elements here we're talking about. So Jira, workflow management, backlog management, putting everybody on the same tool here, because we had a homegrown PTR or ticket tool. And I heard this in Florian's, or in some questions before, there were ticket assigned. Florian talked about it. I exactly know this, obviously ticket assigned, no ticket, no work. And this is something we were breaking up, now introducing some more modern tools, basically coming from the engineering community. So I would say the game changers were pretty much Jira, backlog management. It was basically Ansible and playbooks generation, moving into a different way of deployment. Also opening up the monitoring. We introduced Grafana, Prometheus, basically to allow a more open space for the teams to consume standard monitoring, but also to be able, according to their needs, define the KPIs and dashboards they needed.
How did you identify the unit and pilot teams, or the first building blocks to build it up? Like, where did you get started?
So here I was really lucky to have some team leaders coming from the R&D team, and we were sitting together, and basically they said, "How come I'm in the mood? I want to do this." And it was really good because these were guys that were really integrating the team, that were really taking the team to the journey. And we started, and I was really lucky to also have the same setup on the R&D side, because this was also a challenge to find a peer group that was willing to follow the same approach and spending the budgets. And so we started very, very small. Yeah? And then we let the team promote their own successes. So we took them into internal conferences, basically explaining what they did, inviting people to follow, inviting people to come into their scrums to anticipate what's going on.
What was the seed that led to this change? Was it pain-driven and came basically from the people doing it, or was it a management decision because they saw things are not working appropriately?
I guess it really came from both directions, basically. Yeah? So, I mean, obviously, I was under huge productivity pressure, so to say. Yeah? I mean, it was very difficult for me to get resources, not only because of budgets, but also because, I mean, if you think about recruiting in Munich, in a company like Amadeus, all right, we have a name, yes, but I mean, we cannot compete with the IBMs, the telcos, and so on of this world. So very difficult processes. So I had to really work with my guys. And so this was driving it, but also from the teams. I mean, they sort of were feeling we don't get things done. Yeah? We are always getting back to working on IT debt. We don't get rid of the old stuff, and we really want to drive our own agenda. Yeah? And this is something we were introducing with the common backlogs, and also introducing with, let's say, coding skills coming in to get this worked off faster. We do organize hackathons within the company all over to basically work on automation use cases, where also guys who were not having any coding skills could step in and say, guys, this is my challenge. Who can basically in this hackathon come up with a solution for it? Yeah. So there were all kinds of really activities we were kicking off to get the team into a mode where they were appreciating the change, where they were excited to learn more about it.
How do you actually promote accountability across teams working in the very same topic?
Yeah.
And they're also in different time zones, so communication is always an issue.
What we basically did, Mikhail, is we introduced, and this was starting when we talked about lean. I was working with the teams to build up dashboards, operational dashboards, where you could see certain KPIs, where you could also see certain, let's say, productivity KPIs, and we agreed upon those. And I always said, guys, you decide how you want to do it. But this is the guideline for us. These are the objectives. We want to see this, for example, number of releases in production or number of fallbacks in production. We want to see this decreasing. And this is our golden, let's say, agenda to follow. Yeah? And so we did agree upon these objectives, the corresponding KPIs and the dashboards be upfront. And I was organizing operational review meetings on all layers, whether it's on team layer, whether it is on, say, a middle management layer, or let's say also with my core team, basically, to review the performance of the shop. And this helped to create a certain focus, yeah, and to drive improvement activities into something where people could really see, oh, wow, it's moving. It's really getting better. We started with this number of releases. Now we have 10% more, or, and people learned about the small steps, which you typically don't see if you are very much working on incidents and stuff like that, you typically don't see the improvements. But this was a very important incentive, allowing people to see this.
People want to be a part of the success. Yeah. When I introduced Scrum, Enterprise Scrum at Wirecard, like 2008, I started also very small, and people wanted to be a part of the winning teams. And then I think what is very nice is to see that motivates people, and that automatically people start another teams and, let's say, follow this.
Having very specific goals is always a strong motivation, and especially if they are bounded to a time frame. And I think also that kind of answers the second question about happiness, especially for the people that were already in Amadeus. You mentioned the difficulties of hiring. I mean, I can also speak about that from a startup. What were the incentives that you put to the senior people to stay in Amadeus?
I mean, so basically, I have to admit that a lot of our older people, very senior people, they are with Amadeus for long. And if you think about the benefits coming from, let's say, in particular in Germany, from staying long with one company, I had not really an issue with attrition. Attrition was for me much more with the younger guys who came into the shop and said, "Hey guys, I don't want to work on PTRs all day. I mean, that's not what I'm here for. Yeah, I really want to drive a service coming into production. I want to see this. I want to automate this, you know." And so my concern was much more about keeping the new profiles, the younger guys, let's say, motivated on trying to help our processes to evolve or to move to a new way of working. And then I have to also say, sometimes I really had to ask my very senior guys, please stop working on these very difficult issues in the old world. I want you to focus on this new stuff. I want you to work on how to do automation with creating playbooks, all of these things, yeah? Because I don't want to see you in 5 years being the last guy keeping a system up and running. We then shut down and then you start from square one. I don't want to see this because it will be very difficult for all of us. Yeah? So I was indeed also asking my guys to leave their roles, which are so comfortable and nice because they are the experts. Everybody is looking to them. Oh, you saved us. And get them into a different way of working.
And maybe a quick comment on that. I can, like, from my experience, it's completely different company, different scale, and so on. But we've seen that adopting this Devops methodology has been a very key driver in being able to hire new people, especially seniors.
Yes, absolutely.
So this really paid off from that aspect. You know, one question that I have, so you mentioned these dashboards that have to do with like non-technical metrics. So it's not monitoring, it's like those kind of like number of releases, rollbacks, and so on.
Absolutely.
How do you collect that data?
I mean, so we were basically really taking people into workshops, and we're working, let's say, on what really matters for our customer, whether it's internal customer or basically the Amadeus customer. What matters for them, like uptime, like getting certain features, like keeping certain commitments on when certain features are available in the market, so time to market basically. And out of that, we were building KPIs, and we had a huge initiative which was helping us in 2015 to get this going, which is basically the server deployment pipeline. And this was a very difficult and complex process with more than 100 different units, 100 steps basically needing to happen to bring a server into production. And you can imagine, if you lose 1 day per station, you lose, let's say, 100 days per se. And 1 day is not even a bad example, you know. And so we did this analysis and taking people into a agile way of working, managing this flow. Yeah? And this was such a big story to tell all people about what we are doing here and allow people to think about this, that there was already a good ground settled to think about, okay, so how do our processes look like? What is the real outcome that matters to our customers? And what are the KPIs behind it? And this is not really a self-driving vehicle, because also management, let's say my senior guys, they sometimes said, okay, this is Stefan who wants it. Let's do it for him, you know? And this is something you really have to break and say, guys, no. You make this important for your teams. And you tell me what KPIs you wish to see. Yeah, I don't want to do this as an exercise for me to show me some good results. Yeah? And the team's still frustrated because things are not moving, and we're not helping them, giving the right support with their breakdowns they anticipate in the process flows. You know, so I really was working very hard with the teams to make them own those KPIs and always let them drive this. Yeah? But this is not really, as mentioned, it's not a self-driving thing.
You explained there how you came up with those KPIs. Once the team agreed on them, like how, because if it's something that is manually collected, then it's a lot more error prone. And it's also the kind of thing, like collecting this type of data across multiple teams. It's a bit of a software project in itself.
Yes, absolutely. And that is a big challenge because not necessarily in the beginning we had the skills to drive our own, and the time also, I mean, to drive the build of certain dashboards and reports. So this was really a long, challenging exercise. So I brought in central resources from the central monitoring and reporting team to help us. But I also was freeing up certain resources in my team who were capable to do this, to build these things. And what I allowed people to do is be pragmatic. Start with something very, very basic, because reporting and dashboarding, that's my experience. I don't know how you see this, this is an iterative process. While you stand in front of a KPI, you know what you really need, yeah? And then when you see the next iteration, and then this drives, so I was also allowing teams to change KPIs whenever they felt like, oh, there's not providing value anymore, let's change it.
So I'm also guessing that you have had to do quite some alignment with other verticals, right? With other senior people. And I'm also guessing that it could be hard to justify to maybe like product guys, sales guys, if you're not going to work on or prioritize the operational tickets because you want to work on automation, right?
Right.
So maybe what were your bigger challenges in this area and how did you approach them?
I mean, basically, we were inviting them into the scrums. We were inviting them basically into the discussions with the teams where we would show them that IT debt is at the end of the day, let's say, slowing down their own feature pipeline. Because if you have to deal with so many dependencies because you always wait to the latest moment to upgrade certain software, certain engines you're using, then obviously it gets a very difficult ball game. So we were inviting these guys to explain this to them. I have to admit, sometimes even PCI or these kind of showstoppers also helped me to create this kind of understanding by telling people, hey guys, we cannot discuss this. This is a PCI requirement. The software is out of support. So we do one thing. We stop it. We stop your service or we upgrade your service. But those two options are the only ones you can get. Now, so it was a mixture of different, let's say, of convincing and to a certain extent also a little bit forcing people into a reality they were not used to maybe look into before.
I think at the end of the day, support from senior management is essential. So
yes,
that's my experience. If it's not top-down supported, it becomes very difficult. So I think that's really key as well.
Yes, and this is why I also had to really create, and I was, let's say, asking my development peers, come on guys, look at what you need. What are the KPI? What is the productivity you need to make sure you can show with the DevOps journey we are driving, also your project pipeline is improving. Because that, I needed to take it out of this thing, we help operations. Because that is not really something that helps you over years. People are willing to help you for a certain time period, but if they don't see improvements, then they step out. So I was also from day one very interested in showing there is success stories also on the project, on the development side. They get their stuff faster, more reliable. We don't take them into incidents too often, and these kind of things. So these were important things to show also to the R&D community.
With this long experience you guys had, what to add into as an advice for startups? What would be your, first step?
I mean, I sense that basically letting work teams together, letting teams anticipate, let's say, the end-to-end story, which is developing, but also letting them learn what does it mean to operate the service later on, let them experience incident, let them experience customer demands and so on. So I guess that is a very important rule to consider. The second thing I was thinking about is you need to limit the choices. Yeah? So I guess it's allowed for a team, or it should be allowed for a team to think about the best engine to be used. But while the decision is taken, you have to basically freeze that decision for a certain time period, because I mean, I was taking over teams where basically from one to the other team, even the trouble ticket tool was a different one. Yeah, and not to talk about, let's say, different engines, deployment tools whatsoever to be used, or middleware components. Yeah, so I guess you need to drive a discussion on what is the toolkit we want to work with, what is the engines we want to work with, feeding or serving us best, and then let's say, freeze those choices for a certain time period so that not everybody comes up with an exception, which gives you a zoo and a very difficult thing for next releases. Yeah? And then maybe the third thing is to think about driving a different mentality in terms of it is not release one that really matters. I know that it's difficult to discuss if you have very demanding customer needs and requirements, but it's not release number one. Yeah? It's the releases to follow that really create a success story. Yeah? And I guess that is something you really need to drive with the teams, that they consider to maybe skip one or two shortcomings or quick and dirty stuff to do it right first time. I know it's not possible everywhere, yeah? But that at least for fundamental stuff, you do it right first time and not start with it quick and dirty everywhere, because it will kill you and it will eat up your resources later on.
But I would say at the same time, I would recommend not starting with the full-blown thing. And this is something that we see, like, for example, a concrete example, Kubernetes is absolutely fantastic. But at the same time, if you're working on one startup that has one product, don't go with Kubernetes because you're going to be spending a lot of time figuring out really cool stuff that is probably not relevant. Right. And I think that this is also where there's something really interesting happening in cloud services, where there are more and more tailored solutions that just like things like function as a service or serverless computing. It's just like, it gives you so much out of the box. And yes, it doesn't do everything, but kind of like focusing on building a system that can evolve over time is much more important than building a system that is good.
I mean, we call this gold plating, basically. So you, and in particular, if you have tool teams, you need to stop there. You really need to get things fast in a pragmatic fashion, and then see how requirements evolve, and then also evolve your toolkit with those requirements. I absolutely agree to that.
So how do you communicate or justify this, reducing the scope of release 1 to invest in being quicker with release 2, 3, 4, 5?
I guess we were more like driving with the teams. So what is really essential in release 1? What is really the features that make a difference for the customer, and did it? And obviously introducing agile, large scale also in the R&D or development community did help with that, because management got used to this, that with an agile methodology, sometimes you cannot really predict, will I get it in release 1 or get it in release 2? And this was also helping that storyline a little bit.
I think that's been a really, really useful discussion. Thank you in particular, Florian and Stefan, for taking the time to speak, and for every one of you ultimately for posing some good questions, and a really interesting discussion. Thank you everyone for your time.